Welcome to week 9, everyone. We are nearing the end of our study of the gospel according to Matthew, and I hope that by now you've gained a sense of the intricacy of this story, how deeply embedded it is in the historic drama of Israel as told to us by the Old Testament, in constant conversation with the prophets of Israel's past and the living quality of their words. And now we are in Jerusalem at the climax of the story. Jesus has clashed openly now with the most prominent authorities of his people in the land, right there in the temple courts. He clearly has a target on his back, but the challenge for the authorities is how to get rid of Jesus without unleashing a wave of resistance from the people who are attached to Jesus in a variety of ways and dissatisfied by the authorities for all kinds of good reasons. So, with that, we come to Jesus's final discourse. And what I want to devote this intro video for week 9 to is first a bit of orientation for that discourse, and then say a brief word at the end about your advanced interpretive papers that you're working on. So, first, some orientation to this fifth and final major discourse of Matthew's gospel. I have to start by telling you that my interpretation of this discourse, what you'll hear on the podcast this week, which is especially important, I would say, is unconventional and may cause you some measure of existential disturbance. And that is because the language of this discourse has often been interpreted to be about uh, events that we associate with the end of the world and the second coming of Christ. But I actually think that that interpretation is wrong, and that Jesus is, in fact, describing other events nearer to his apostles' own time, to his own time, events that are intimately tied to the way that he himself will die, and uh, events that require us to pay attention to the arc of Matthew's narrative this to this point to be able to interpret well. The tendency that Christians have had to interpret this discourse as suddenly picturing for Jesus's disciples the end of the world, or what we think of as the second coming of Christ, I think has been out of touch with the arc of this gospel narrative. And so that's really how my interpretation is attempting to present this final discourse, is in the flow of the gospel story that we've been studying to this point. One of the major contextual problems that I want to point out before giving a few more details about the discourse itself is that the language of the discourse is characteristic of what we might call Jewish apocalyptic, which was in fact a very pervasive and familiar kind of language and speech and communication in Jesus's day, in Matthew's day, really for generations even leading up to their time. But that language, that genre of literature, grew to be relatively strange and unfamiliar to subsequent generations of non Jewish interpreters of Matthew's story. And that is partly why I think we have interpreted this discourse poorly, in my judgment, and taken it to be about a sort of mythological event that we associate with the end of the world and the second coming of Christ. This apocalyptic language is not, in fact, without precedent either, and this is also part of the problem. Just as you have heard me say many times now that familiarity with the prophets will add a great deal of needed framework for understanding what Jesus is doing, what he is saying, especially when he quotes from the prophets, as he has from Jeremiah and Isaiah in the temple courts, for example. And we have precursors in those prophets to this apocalyptic language. One of the key precursors is in the book of Isaiah in chapter 13, which Jesus will quote in this discourse where Jesus talks about the moon being darkened and stars falling from the sky. And it is common for Christians of our time and of some generations uh, from some generations back to think of that as something that you could see with a telescope or as something that you're supposed to see by looking up into the sky to see the movement of heavenly bodies. But if you look at where Jesus is quoting from in Isaiah 13, it is clearly about the fall of Babylon, the Babylonian empire based in the city of Babylon. So that the language of stars falling from the skies and the sort of cataclysm taking place in the heavenly bodies is a way of making sense of the sort of earth shattering and far reaching significance of events that are unfolding on the earth. And that is, I think, relatively plain in Isaiah 13. But our tendency to neglect those sources and to be unfamiliar with them leads us to jump to other interpretations as we're reading Jesus is quoting those words in Matthew 24. So that is one of the key contextual challenges that we bring to this story. And you'll hear me in the podcast exposition of the discourse working at bringing that key context of the prophets and then apocalyptic literature, not the least of which is the book of Daniel, into our frame of reference as we make sense of what Jesus is saying. The other sort of bit of orientation that I want to give you to this discourse that I will go into more detail in the podcast exposition is the way that this discourse is occasioned by the flow of the narrative and the words that are given to us at the beginning of the discourse. Jesus has just been clashing with the various authorities of his people in the courts of the temple. He has given his disciples an image of what is coming with the withering of the fig tree. Up until now, throughout the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus has been preparing his disciples for this change of regime, this change of governing power that is coming to their land, to their people, and going to spread from there to reach the four corners of the earth. And he has begun to tie this specifically to the way that he himself will be killed and then be raised from among the dead. Uh, all of that is what has been leading up to this climactic conclusion to the story in Jerusalem. And so it really doesn't make sense for Jesus to suddenly cast his disciples' gaze to events that are nowhere near their time and to take place at the end of the world many millennia perhaps afterward, at least 2 millennia so far, we might say. Instead, he speaks, as he has all the way until this time, of something that is on the near horizon, something that is unfolding in this generation, so that what he describes in Matthew 24 to 25 will come to pass before this generation passes away. He has already told his disciples about this same coming of the Son of Man that he's going to be describing as something that will take place before they have finished even going through the cities and towns of Israel when he sends them out to do that in Matthew chapter 10. So there are all kinds of indicators in the Gospel of Matthew about how Jesus is describing near events, events that are near to the horizon of his life, his disciples' life, rather than something that should be sort of assigned to the end of the world. We, of course, think of things like the coming of the Son of Man in terms that are semi technical. We think of that as the second coming of Jesus. That's what it sort of springs to our minds. But we have to ask if that is indeed what Jesus, through the teaching of Matthew, has led us to understand the coming of the Son of Man to be. And so, with that, just look briefly, you can, with your Bible in front of you, or just think about it here. The beginning of the discourse is Jesus has just had these clashes with authorities. He is now walking away from the temple. And as he is walking away, his disciples want to call Jesus's attention to these magnificent stones, these gargantuan architectural structures that are part of this fortress in Jerusalem. And of course, thinking about what Jesus has been telling them about the coming of the kingdom that is about to unfold and has already begun. And Jesus replies with a horrifying prediction that then occasions a question from the disciples. He says, "Truly, I tell you, do you see all of these stones? None of them will be left one upon another, but all of them will be thrown down." This is a almost unimaginable catastrophe, and it leads his disciples to then approach him more privately, three of them especially, to ask him, when will these things that you have just said take place? And what will be the time of your coming and the sign of the coming of the Son of Man? They associate all of those things with what Jesus has just predicted as the fall of these massive stones of the temple fortress and Jerusalem around it to the ground, which can only mean, of course, a catastrophic war that would wreak such destruction upon this apparently impregnable fortress. And so all of Jesus's discourse from chapter 24 to 25 is a response to this question about the disciples. And at this point in the narrative, I'll defend this interpretation in the podcast exposition that Jesus never varies from answering this question about when these terrible events that he has just described will take place and what will be the sign that they're about to take place as the coming to power of the Son of Man, whom he specifically embodies. A vision of Daniel 7 that we've already begun to hear about earlier in Matthew, and we'll hear more about in Jesus's trial before the high priest and others of the Sanhedrin in the next couple chapters. So that occasion of the discourse, the question that the disciples ask and that Jesus then begins to answer, needs to be taken seriously, I think, as a sustained constraint on what Jesus is talking about. And so do try, as you're studying this discourse this week, to take these considerations into account and to subject the words of the discourse as we're studying them to these kinds of considerations that I hope we've developed the ability to cultivate and to take into account in our interpretation through our study of the Gospel of Matthew to this point. Again, the resources are especially important this week. Secondary resources of the podcast exposition, but also a primary text, which is a Jewish figure's account of the events that Jesus is describing, the fall of the temple as a consequence of a terrible civil war, and then finally a Roman invasion. And that's the writer Josephus. So I've excerpted part of his work called The Jewish War for you to read, hopefully in an attempt to give you some sense of how significant and earth-shattering, world-changing these events that unfolded within a generation of Jesus's life were and remain in terms of their reverberating effect in our own time. Few words here about the advanced interpretive paper before I close. Several of you have observed the challenge of moving from the working paper that you have already worked on to the advanced paper. And some of you got a little ahead of yourselves, perhaps in the working paper, and were already marshaling a pretty kind of decisive argument in defense of your passage. There's always room, however, to enhance your treatment of a passage by studying it carefully again and considering particulars of the passage that you have not been able to attend to adequately, perhaps in the working paper. Here's just some thoughts about how to go about it. Your advanced paper is designed to give you the ability to articulate the abiding thrust, the force of this particular passage as a unit within the story. So your paper needs to begin by expressing what you take that uh, force of the passage to be. And then you're going to devote the rest of your paper to substantiating that thesis and defending it by appealing to the passage. The fact that the passage has a kind of force as a unit implies that its parts fit together. And so part of the task of your paper is to, first of all, identify what seem to be the stages of the passage's development, and then to articulate how those stages build to deliver the message of the passage that you interpret it to convey. Uh, that's about sort of holding the parts of the passage together and showing how they fit together to achieve their purpose, the message that they have. Of course, that message is not something that the passage has independently of its position in the narrative. And so you also need to spend some time in your paper. And this might be something that sort of punctuates your paper throughout, or something that you speak to more directly at the beginning of the paper. But time in your paper situating clearly your passage in the flow of the narrative, so that the way that its force depends on where it comes in the story is clear. Make sure that as you do this, situating the passage in its kind of flow in the narrative and dealing with how the parts fit together as a coherent whole, that you are attending to details of the passage, textual details, and not in a way that's sort of haphazard, but is dealing with them as they are pertinent to the development of the passage. You won't be able to give the same level of attention to every textual detail. So you have to decide which details are the most crucial for you to be able to clarify what the meaning of the passage is. One last thing, and this is developed in the assignment guide, but it is that the Gospel of Matthew is part of this genre of literature that we call gospel, good news that is especially associated with uh, the rule of a governing authority that brings freedom, that brings abundance of life. That's what gospel is about. And your interpretation should have something of that music to it. One way of saying this is that your paper should preach. If your paper sounds only like sort of cold, sterile analysis, then you're not carrying the development of your interpretation far enough. So you want to do a study of the passage that is probably more sophisticated than you could ever get away with doing in a sermon, more technical than a sermon might be, but still has that quality of a good sermon that calls to the listener, appeals to the reader, makes a claim on those who are reading your paper, including me, about what this passage is saying to you, to us, how it is God's word to us. So that's not an easy balance to strike, you know, that level of technical detail, sophistication on the one hand, but then the kind of homiletical quality of having some edge, some bristling claim to it. But I want you to try to work at that, because I think that that is actually what faithfully interpreting this gospel story of Matthew involves. God bless you as you study this week, and looking forward to some more great conversations.